Please join me in inviting Dr. Zakaria back on stage to host our conversation, and a warm round of applause for DPM as he joins Dr. Zakaria on stage.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for gracing us. This is an extraordinary conference that the NUS and the Lee Kuan Yew School has put together. Last night we had one extraordinary perspective from the Prime Minister of Singapore. And at lunch, we get another extraordinary perspective from the Deputy Prime Minister, who is somebody I have known for many, many years. I will tell you how I first met him. 10 years ago, I asked Kishore Mahbubani, well, I keep coming to Singapore. I see you. I have the honor to see Lee Kuan Yew. I see Lee Hsien Loong. Who's the smartest person in Singapore other than that I should meet? Tharman was at the time Minister of Education, and I've had the honor and privilege of knowing him ever since. So I thought what we do is range widely, but given your expertise in central banking, finance, and the fact that you are really so plugged in the world of international finance. I don't know how many of you know, Tharman has just been elected, I think it is, to the Group of 30, which is really the 30 top international financial policy makers in the world. People like Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, and people like that. And the membership is restricted to 30. Simple question. What is the likelihood that what is happening in Greece is going to be another Lehman-like moment in the international financial system?
My sense is very low. I think on both sides of the negotiations, there's a desire to avoid catastrophe. On one side, to avoid catastrophe for their own people in Greece, and on the part of Germany and the Europeans generally, avoiding a major setback to the European project. Having said that, the twists and turns, which are on average every 6 hours in this set of negotiations, does distract from the larger underlying challenge for Greece and for Europe, which is not about finding a program for the next 3 years, which is what all these discussions have been about. It is about, first, the clear unsustainability of the debt burden that Greece has, which is not just its fault. Second, the basic lack of a public administration that will allow it to rebuild, which will take 10, 20 years. And that's a central task. They lack a public administration to collect taxes, to dispense it fairly, to preserve a sense of equity in their society. So you get very good speeches, and Syriza makes very good speeches, but they don't have the administration, the institutions, and the trust of their citizens to be able to implement anything. And that's the central task. I mean, Greece got independence from the Ottomans in 1832. And in half the years since then, they have defaulted on sovereign debt. So trust is low. It's been weakened, especially in the last few years. It was partly the fault of the creditors for demanding too much austerity and causing too much pain to a population so that no government could deliver what was being asked for. But it's also part of the broader challenge and tragedy of governance.
So 2 questions come out of that. How would you have handled the European problem? Because there are two schools of thought.
It's another opportunity to walk out of this.
One school of thought says there's, the Paul Krugman school, that this was crazy to have these demands of austerity, that you were asking people to cut government spending at the very moment when the private sector had collapsed and private demand had collapsed. Government spending is the only thing that was keeping these economies going. There's another side which says, look, that's all well and good, but debt was already at 90% of GDP. You can't keep piling it on. How would you have navigated between those two shows?
Well, I think first, in the first wave of the crisis, they were reluctant to do things which made sense for the long term, and that's understandable. What makes sense for the long term is to write down the debts. You can call it restructuring, and the IMF has just come out with a proposal to stretch it out over 40 years with no payments in the first 20 years. It effectively recognizes the fact that Greece is unable to pay its debts. But to do it in the first wave of crisis risks a Lehman moment. It risks a Lehman moment. They should have not delayed it so long, though. And even now, I think there's a great reluctance to accept that reality. So that's the first step. Greece cannot pay its debts. And something has to be done to reduce those debts, or if you want the pretense of stretching it out over 40 years or 60 years, so be it. Second, however, is to accept that you need public administration to be able to implement policies in a fair and equitable way. And someone has to work with them to develop this. It will take time. It's more of the mindset of a developmental bank rather than a firefighting institution, but that's a central task.
So the second question that comes out of it is you were talking about the essential uncompetitiveness of the Greek economy. Now, among those of us who admire Singapore in the Western world, sometimes you look at a totally dysfunctional country and say, if only Lee Kuan Yew could take over, this would work. So let's assume that's a metaphor for the Singaporeans could take over. So if the Singaporeans took over Greece, what would you do? It's not so facetious. My point is, how would one structure a place like Greece to be competitive?
So maybe I'll put it in a way that will make it easier for me to answer. What if we were Greece, right? And we had a Greece situation here. I would say first, there has to be great value in politics of speaking straight. Telling people what the problems are, telling people how there has to be some pain in order that we see some light at the end of the tunnel. And we can get out of the tunnel together. But it's going to take some time, and everyone has to take a sacrifice. That includes the rich, who are parking their deposits overseas. It includes the pensioners, who are not rich, but they've got benefits that no young person can ever dream of getting in future. So someone has to adjust. So everyone has to adjust. Let's be frank about it. Let's share in the pain, but let's work our way out of this. So just speaking the truth is a critical requirement, whether you're on the left or the right. You've got to speak the truth. And secondly, you've got to do what you say, because the population only believes what you say if they see you doing it, and they see you doing it repeatedly and with some firmness and assurance.
When one looks at Singapore, people who admire it, it's funny sometimes you talk to businessmen in the Western world and they speak about it as if it is some kind of free market paradise. Low taxes, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. This is their fantasy of what the United States should be. And then you tell them, do you know that almost 90% of Singaporeans live in public housing? Do you know the investments that it makes in education, which are all state directed? Do you know the fact that there are no private schools at the primary level in Singapore? You are forced into the public school system precisely because they want to give that value. And then they begin to think, my God, this is a socialist paradise, not a free market paradise. What is it? What is the Singapore model?
So that's a good way of putting it. We get praised and criticized too easily. We get praised too easily by conservatives who think that this is a low-tax paradise and it's a free market system. It isn't. The economy is basically free market. It's a competitive, open economy. It has to live by the dictates of global competition. But we believe that there is a role for government to intervene, to mitigate inequalities by maximizing chances for every citizen. We're trying to do it in new ways. We're experimenting, but we believe that is the role of government. You've got to help people who start with less and give everyone a chance of making the best of life. Second thing that we believe in quite strongly is that there's always a tendency in society for some form of polarization to develop. And it's either based on socioeconomic characteristics, wealthy versus poor. It's based on race or religion, or in some countries it's based on intra-faith, sectarian conflicts. And a central role of government in any modern democracy has to be to preserve the center and to constantly lean against polarizing forces and to unify people. So that's not just about strategies for social mobility and education, which are of course fundamental. It's also about how people engage with each other. It's about your institutions that encourage that. And it's about developing a strong civil society where it's not just the government, but people who have it in their interests and in their passions to want to keep society together and preserve the center. Preserving the center is a central challenge for every modern democracy.
I asked the Prime Minister this yesterday. So let me ask you slightly differently, which is, Singapore, fairly early on, Lee Kuan Yew once said to me, I was like Nehru, I believed in socialism. I just at some point realized it wasn't working. Singapore very early on adopts a strategy of courting foreign investment, which strikes me as, in many ways, at the core of this free market. Because once you do that, you realize what you have to do to bring foreign investment in, to keep it happy. At the time, in the 1960s, and I remember this growing up in India, this was reviled as a strategy. This was seen as a strategy of colonial lackeys. It was seen as a strategy that would only favor the rich. The much sexier strategy, as it were, was import substitution, massive state investments. What do you think explains the fact that Singapore, and to a certain extent, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, bucked the trend?
Well, we bucked the trend in quite different ways when we'll come to it in a minute. But in Singapore's case, the great advantage that we created is that we started with very little choice. We started with the disadvantage of being small, separated from the Malayan Peninsula. We did not have a serious option of pursuing what was the conventional wisdom at the time. Raoul Prebisch at the UN, and it was a conventional development economics wisdom, which was some form of import substitution. We just didn't have that choice. Second, there was a streak of opportunism in the first generation of leaders. They saw something that was coming, which was that first wave of globalization of manufacturing, starting in electronics, in semiconductors, in fact, coming out of the United States. And we seized it very early. We seized it very early. Again, the fact that you lack choices in life is an advantage. It makes you realize you've got to go out there and make yourself relevant. And I think that converting of disadvantage to advantage has been the Singapore story. That converting of a permanent disadvantage, which we still live with, into continuing advantage, continually refreshed, continually reinvented, is the mindset and the culture, not just of government, but of enterprise and our people.
So how do you do it when you actually do not have a permanent structural disadvantage right now? You may say that, but that's a rhetorical point. You're one of the richest countries in the world. You have one of the best infrastructures in the world. You are, a great tour destination for people from far and wide. How do you convince your children that they still have to be, they have to work as if they were hungry?
You're coming close to home, by the way. It's...
I somehow have a feeling that between you and your wife, you're doing all right on that.
So,
I imagine the Tiger
no,
Mom book hasn't even seen, what
it is a
it's
tendency
like.
in every society that advances and achieves a better standard of living for its people. It's happened in the Scandinavian economies. It's happened in every part of the world, and we are no different. The wrong way to do it is to mismanage the economy and the society so that you get crises or repeated crises, and then people wake up and realize that they're vulnerable. It's a strategy that is inadvertently being pursued in some parts of the world. The better way of doing it is to make sure that what you've built up in its fundamentals is preserved, but always realize in government, in enterprise, and in society that there's someone else coming up behind you who can do just as well or better. And it means we've got to keep improving. And this next phase of development of our economy and society is, to my mind, a very exciting one. I mean, we started off as a nation of traders, buying and selling, in fact, pre-independence. We had a financial sector that was also largely involved in just financing, buying, and selling. Then after independence, we realized that we could take advantage of globalization, and we just wanted to add value somewhere in that global value chain. Initially adding value by having lower labor costs and lower costs generally. Later on, adding value by being able to handle the complex part of that value chain. But it was a value-add strategy. In this next phase, it's basically about creating value, having our own value chains, our own brands, and even working with multinationals to do value creation in Singapore, not just taking a technology or a process that's invented somewhere else, test-bidded somewhere else, and then finally brought here when it's mature. We have to be in the game of value creation. And that's a whole different set of skill sets, mindsets, and culture. More innovative, a greater sense of individuality. People wanting to do things originally, whether you're working in a large firm or you're a startup, wanting to do things in an original way.
So when we talked 10 years ago, you said to me something which I thought was very, very interesting, which was we were talking about how Singapore does very well on those tests, the PISA tests, and the US doesn't do well, but the US still succeeds in the world of innovation. And you said to me, well, we both have meritocracies, and our systems are very meritocratic. Ours is a meritocracy of testing. We have taught our children how to take tests well. Yours is a meritocracy of problem solving. You have taught people how to problem solve well and to think independently. And perhaps it turns out that in creating value, in creating new companies, new ideas, that second meritocracy is actually more crucial. Do you think that Singapore is making the transition to that second one? And doesn't it require a much more open intellectual, economic, and even political space where people have the ability to be disrespectful to even the Prime Minister?
So it's a very large question, and frankly a very complex one. First, I think when you compare us with, let's say, the United States, there's something impressive about the US, but it's only for a relatively small slice or segment of its population. Typically, they went to private schools and a few top public schools. They went to Ivy League universities, and those who dropped out the best. There's a certain freewheeling culture, but it's frankly very small. I mean, the Bay Area is just one corner of the United States. And the gulf that you have in public education, the valley really that you have in public education, is still the big US educational challenge, with serious issues of equity that come out of that. Our strategy was different, a bit bloody-minded in meritocracy, but everyone is able to take the same tests on a fair basis, transparent and fair. And it allowed for tremendous social mobility, still does, still far more than the United States or most Western European countries. But unfortunately, that spirit of individuality, that free play of the mind, isn't best developed in a system that's highly competitive and focused on tests. How do we go forward? I make no excuses for what we've done so far because it's uplifted a whole population. How do we go forward without creating a gulf of standards that the bulk of your population is exposed to? I think there are ways of doing it, but the toughest question we have to ask ourselves is not what we add into the education system, but what we subtract. And that's always a challenge, particularly if you're doing things quite well. I mean, if we are topping the PISA tables, we are well admired as an education system. What do you take out of the system is a real challenge, and it requires some courage. Because the fact of the matter is that the things you want kids to experience as they grow up aren't just to do with curriculum content. They're to do with what's outside the curriculum. Time to reflect, time to just think for yourself, to explore, time to interact and develop a sense of fellowship. And those are two quite fundamental things. Thinking for yourself and having a sense of individuality is not at odds with developing a strong sense of fellowship as you grow up with people who are quite different from you, different social backgrounds, different races and religions. It's not at odds, and it can be done. But in order to provide space for that, you've got to take something out and accept that there is a trade-off. We're not going to be as good at age 12 or 18 in certain things, but you've got to provide that space and watch it as we go. So the advantage is we're starting from a system that's working well, and that's an achievement because few developing countries achieved it. But the challenge going forward is to know what to take out and what to encourage within the free space that you're creating.
But what about the issue of challenging authority? I look at, there's a very famous moment when Niels Bohr, the great theoretical physicist, is said to have begun every lecture of his at the University of Copenhagen by looking at his students and saying, I want you to keep in mind that everything I'm telling you may be wrong. And then he would begin his lecture. Because he wanted students to challenge authority, to not accept as received wisdom what was being provided. My observation, that's the hardest thing, and not just in Singapore, in China, in South Korea. How do you get people to have that sense of challenging authority? And is it not tied up with a political system that does not encourage dissent either?
So I think the first part of your question, what you're suggesting is basically correct. That starting early in life, you've just got to encourage kids to question, to speak up. And it's not as if it's not possible in Asian culture. I mean, you originally came from a part of the world where speaking up is, it's a very rich tradition. And you have to look at Chinese cities today. I mean, if you go to the leading schools in China, I mean, they're extremely individualistic and they speak up. So you must have that culture starting from very young, preschool, primary school, where kids speak up. You don't need to always make sense, you don't need to speak logically, but you've got to have a mind of your own. And there's something to it. I believe in that. I think what it implies for political culture and systems is, we just need some humility on this. You look at Switzerland, highly innovative place. I mean, they're not just tinkering with watches, they're highly innovative people.
But they've had 500 years of democracy.
But it's a very different democracy. Yeah. There's a very deep respect for each other. There are very strong social norms. You don't create noise beyond a certain hour at night if you're living in the same block as, you don't make life difficult for your neighbors. Very strong social norms. A very strong sense that we must respect each other and there's a certain sameness about us. It's quite different from the American culture, and I think we should keep our minds open as to how this will evolve. We can't decide how 30 or 40 years from now our politics will be. We can't decide in advance, but we have a very good reason, based on our history and our sense of the reality we operate in, that we do need a system where the center holds strong. And the center doesn't hold strong because of the invisible hand of society. Quite the opposite. The invisible hand of society tends to pull things away from the center. It holds strong because you've got a government elected by people that works to keep it strong.
Let me ask you about the future politics of Singapore then. Do you believe that the fact that you are now in such a commanding majority in Parliament by any country's standards — I realize the last election was by Singaporean standards, a setback for the government — do you believe that it gives you the opportunity to pursue policies that you think are in the long-term interests of the country and allow you not to have to pander to short-term interests, pander to certain communities? And is that something that you are consciously trying to pursue?
Well, first, the shifts in policies that we've taken, both on the economic and social side, and especially in social policy, predated the 2011 general elections. And it's a bit of an overtold story that, well, there was a sea change after the 2011 general elections. We started a major shift in our policies before that, starting in 2008 and building progressively, step by step, reforming our policies aimed at building a more inclusive society, providing better security for the elderly, and working harder at social mobility. There is a sense in which, if your vote goes down significantly, any government will tend to focus more on the short term than the long term. That's a reality of politics all over the world. And we will, certainly the current government, wants as much as it can to preserve a culture where we keep thinking long term in the interests of people, because it's fairer. It's fairer. It's much fairer to tell people that it's not just about what we can give today, but what we can sustain in the future. And the societies that haven't done that end up hurting the poor and the middle income groups. That's the reality of it. It's not just about intergenerational equity, about the old versus the young. It's also about the rich versus the poor, because it's always the poor who suffer when you're unable to sustain the welfare policies that you start off with.
But when you look at every other advanced industrial country, what you notice is that they go through at some point, they become comfortable enough and they become open and democratic enough that the government starts to focus on short-term consumption versus long-term investment. It starts providing benefits to people who are the present generation, as opposed to maintaining
Absolutely.
For the future.
Yeah.
How will you escape this trap? How will you ensure that you don't follow this same path? Because I think you and I have talked about this.
Right.
The Northern Europeans are very hard workers. These are not soft people.
Absolutely.
And yet look at what has happened to most Northern European societies.
So it requires leadership, and it requires a political culture that leadership tries to engender and sustain. And I think we have, in Singapore, created that culture amongst our people. You cannot win votes in Singapore by promising the absurd. You can't win votes in Singapore by pandering purely to the present without explaining to people how it's going to be financed. I think we've created some of that culture. It can easily slip away. It can easily slip away. But I think we've created some of that culture, and we've got to strengthen it. We've got to try as best as we can to avoid what's happened in many other societies.
The specifics of it seems to me, are largely relating to pensions and healthcare. So if you look at, people will often say in Western societies, particularly conservatives, we have all these programs for the poor, or all these programs in the government spending too much on education or whatever. But these don't actually cost that much. What costs an enormous amount of money, the reason Europe is facing all these is pensions and healthcare. In a society that is getting older, how do you avoid these, those two things taking up a larger and larger part of the budget? Because what you have been able to achieve in Singapore is quite extraordinary social results while spending a limited amount, and that's largely because you've kept healthcare and pension costs very manageable.
So it's a very important question. I would make 2 points. I mean, earlier on I was talking about leadership and culture, but policies and institutions count. In healthcare, I think the main lesson that one has to derive from all the experiences around the world, including the American, is that it's essential to have charges that you pay when you use healthcare. And then if you're poor and you can't afford it, you get some support. But it's very important for people to realize that you don't go to a hospital and everything is paid for by insurance or from state revenues. It has created a system where outcomes are actually very good by international standards, but at lower costs. And the US is the other end of the spectrum. But you also have some other countries which are not insurance-driven as it is in the US, where it's just state taxes that fund the system, where you get uncontrollable increases in costs. Because doctors just prescribe what they want, knowing that the state is going to pay, and the patient takes as much as possible. So it's very hard when you talk about it in healthcare, because it's not about being unkind to people. In fact, it's about being fair. Because the reality of the matter is in the countries where things are free in healthcare, the middle class is paying for it with a very high rate of taxes. You're buying prepaid health insurance when you're paying your value-added tax or your income tax in order to get free healthcare. But the net result is that costs go up. So I think we need the right incentives for doctors.
But again, you have a mixed system where essentially it's a state.
The public healthcare system is a large anchor in the system, but incentives matter. The second very important strategy, and we're not the leaders in this, is to shift healthcare away from the acute care hospitals and focus more on primary care and step-down care, long-term care outside of hospitals. Is not only cheaper, and certainly primary care is cheaper for the whole system because you prevent problems from getting worse, and step-down care is cheaper, but it's also not just cheaper, it's also providing for a more caring environment closer to home, either at home or close to home. So we've got to develop a diversified healthcare system, which is what we're doing.
So in sum, your model for sort of Singaporean social democracy would be different from European social democracy. How?
First, because it is similar to European social democracy in the sense that it requires an activist government, but it's very different in 2 regards. First, it focuses as much as we can on keeping alive a culture of responsibility. Personal responsibility, family responsibility, community responsibility. And it's not a contradiction to have an activist government trying to keep alive a culture of responsibility on the part of individuals, family, and community. If you don't do anything and leave everyone to the fate of the market, you get a society that gets too unequal in its chances, and the morale of society is weakened. But if you do something by simply substituting for the responsibility of the individual or the family, or taking over what community organizations were doing, you end up with a society where not only does the bill go up, but you just weaken that drive and that vim in your society. So the strategy has to be it's not a free market strategy, it's one of an activist government, but it's an activist government that seeks to strengthen that culture that all our societies have in them, a culture of responsibility. And it can be done in education. It can be done through home ownership. It can be done through subsidies for work rather than subsidies for not working. And it can be done in the way we treat our seniors and the role of the family that's accompanied by the role of the state.
And in that model, in that vision of the future, what do you think the politics of Singapore will look like? Do you think it's healthy for a single party to rule the country 15 years from now?
Well, I think the politics has to be one where whoever the government is, it needs to be committed to the two things I spoke about. First, focus on the long term and speak the truth. Tell people that what we do today shapes what happens tomorrow, and we've got to build the long term into what we do today. And secondly, hold the center strong.
But is there an inherent advantage?
There's an advantage in having a dominant player in politics. That's the empirical reality. That's what the evidence shows. There is an advantage in having a dominant player in politics.
There's an advantage in having a one-party state or a dominant player in politics?
A one-party state will be a disadvantage. It lacks the competition, it lacks the contest, and we don't have a one-party state. We've got to be subjected to serious competition as we are.
You have 80 out of 87 seats. How is that serious competition?
That's an outcome. That's not a design.
But
let me put it this way. I spend about a third of my week in activities that are best characterized as retail politics. I'm on the ground. I'm meeting residents. What am I doing this weekend? I'm attending an event at a Sikh temple. I'm attending an event at a Ceylonese Tamil community, celebration of SG50. I'm visiting my residents home to home in their blocks, majority Chinese but multiracial. Yesterday I was at a iftar, interestingly, not just amongst Muslims, but with a Christian leader, Sikh leaders, Hindu leaders, all very normal, not newsworthy, not a media event, all just the normal course of everyday life in Singapore. But I, as a politician, as a minister, spend a lot of my week on the ground, interacting with people. It's not what you see in typical one-party states. Not even what you see in multi-party states where you have a dominant party that fixes the system.
But you said that competition is useful. What I'm trying to get, is there an inherent virtue in some rotation?
This is I know you're quite obsessed with this issue, but let me put it this way. We know what has worked. We know the constraints under which we function. In theory, I would say if this was a good high school exercise, that's a meaningful debate. It's a meaningful debate, and not a trivial one. In practice, do you put your citizenry at risk by saying, look, let's try this out and see how it works? I'd rather someone else try it out, and I've seen someone else try it out, and I'd like to preserve this as much as it can. But it only works if whoever's the dominant party is accountable to the people, and accountable both through a vote that comes through in elections once every 5 years, as well as accountable in between. People see results. They're not fools. Singaporeans are not fools at all. They know what's what. They know whether things are working or whether they're not working. And they will have to judge. So it only works if you're subjected to contest and you're held accountable.
You said something in a different symposium recently in Switzerland, in which you said that the Chinese leadership was accountable, in fact, in some ways more accountable than the Indian leadership. And the reason I'm pushing you on these issues is I thought it was a somewhat puzzling statement because, India, for all its flaws, which it has many, its leadership is highly accountable, often thrown out of office. Almost nobody has stayed in office more than 4 or 5 years. they are accountable to the electorate for what it perceives as a good performance, which might be doling out favors, which may be long-term growth, and it's varied. In China, you see, on the other hand, fantastic amounts of corruption. Still a machine that works very well, but if you look at the levels of corruption, only because the Chinese economy is so large, it is probably the largest collective corruption, certainly in recently recorded history. How is that accountable?
No, I think that's a good question, and I wouldn't idealize the Chinese at all. They have major challenges that are not just political challenges, but the way their society is going to evolve. I use the Chinese example as a contrast to India to illustrate a point, which is that the most lively Asian democracies, as described quite narrowly by how often parties rotate, how severe the contest is, even how loud the contest is, have not been democracies that are accountable to the people for results. They're very lively democracies, but they're not accountable for the results. And it'll be, I don't want to be simplistic in my description of Indian politics, but there's a very strong role of caste, of religion, of lineage, at a local level as well as at a larger than local level in Indian politics that shapes votes. So that people are not just voting based on what you did and whether you did what you promised, they're voting on other bases. And that's the reality of human society and democracies. And I contrasted China with that, not in order to idolize China, but to say that in a curious way, perhaps even because China doesn't have a system of democracy that provides legitimacy by being elected as a government, it does pay fairly close attention to results in order to sustain its legitimacy. It's not an ideal system. It may not be sustainable for the long term, but I'm just merely making that point in order to illustrate the weaknesses of thinking that the sheer liveliness of democracy is what leads to accountability. It unfortunately hasn't.
You have to track the Chinese economy and political system very closely, because obviously Singapore, like all Asian countries, lives under its shadow now. What is your sense in this debate about whether China is now actually growing much slower than people think it is, that its consolidated debt is now, if you look at all private and public debt is at 240% of GDP, which is higher than anyone has ever imagined, and that it is ultimately going to have a much rougher next 5 years than it's had the previous 35?
I think all those descriptions are basically correct, but they do not face the risk in the near to medium term of major destabilization, economic or otherwise. The debts are higher than should be the case, and part of it is due to what happened 5 years ago during the crisis, where they pump primed through credit from the banking system and the shadow banking system, but their assets are also very substantial. So they don't have a problem of large unfunded liabilities in the system as a whole, but there are pockets of the system which are either bankrupt or unsustainable financial situation, but the system as a whole should be able to take care of it. The bigger issue in China is not getting past the excesses of recent years. The bigger issue is moving towards a more market-based economy, and that's a very complicated challenge. And I think they're moving in the right direction at a different pace in different areas of reforms. But it's quite admirable what they've been able to do so far. The fact that the fact that they've got a plan for the medium term is already a rarity internationally. It's
not just rhetoric. You don't think
it's not just rhetoric. They've got specific programs.
Li Keqiang, the premier, has made very, very good speeches. Have they been actually implemented?
In some areas, much better than others. I mean, we look at the fiscal reforms, the reform of local and central government revenue sharing, and how local government expenditures are to be financed. A very impressive pace at which they proceeded. If you look at the reforms in the financial sector, which is a very complex area, I think they're proceeding in the right direction and managing the situation quite well. Reform of state enterprises, slower than expected, but everything is moving in the right direction. And they've got a vision, they've got plans to get there. They're complex, there are pitfalls along the way, but having a vision and plans to get there is something. You need a third plenum in the United States.
Well, you were talking about speaking your mind and things like that. I remember a friend of mine who's a CEO who has a factory in China and in India. I said to him, "What's the big difference?" He said, "Well, in China it's very difficult to get the managers to really speak honestly about what the problem is. They're very deferential. They don't explain." I said, "In India, what's the problem?" He said, "Exactly the opposite. You can't get them to shut up. Everyone has his own theory of what they would do as CEO." So I think the United States, you have that problem, which is if you had a plenum, you would have, imagine a plenum at which the Tea Party, the Democrats and Bernie Sanders were all to try and craft a common vision for the United States.
But it's not so distant from today. If you look back to the United States, 15 years ago, you had something of a bipartisan consensus on most major issues. And when things got really tough, you had a plenum. So it's not so distant in your history.
Yeah, the Cold War in some ways disciplined America. It's always useful to have competition. Whether you're an athlete, whether you're in any situation, and the Cold War created a certain level of a kind of competition for America. Think about the enormous investments in science and education that the United States made in the 60s, spooked by Sputnik and the fear that the Soviet Union was winning the space race. These are investments that essentially created Silicon Valley in some ways. Think about Hubert Humphrey once said that he thought the most important foreign policy act that the United States made in the 1960s was the Civil Rights Act, because by signaling to the world that by signaling to the world that we were inclusive, you were doing more than sending divisions into Vietnam. We lack that discipline, and I don't know that there is something on the horizon that will change that. Perhaps China, but that's an unfortunate circumstance, because you don't want to create an unnecessary and confrontational adversarial view with China. And it relates to the question I asked you about adversity. How do you convince Singaporeans when things are not that threatened, that they still have to have the same kind of drive, benchmark to best practices, do everything at the level, perform at a certain level when they don't actually face that competition?
So it's, you've described it very well, and I think the best way of doing it is to provide opportunities that people find exciting in a very personal way. And I see very encouraging trends. If I look at the current generation of people leaving school, leaving university, they're quite different from even today's middle-age group. They're quite different. They're willing to do things that involve not just taking the straightest road to where you want to get, and you can actually see the road from the start, know where it ends. You're willing to take a road with bends, even if you can't see beyond the bend. And they're able to do it in a way that passes the mother-in-law test.
Which is?
In other words, I'm a guy or girl who's going to get involved in a startup. I don't know where it's going to lead, and in fact, I know the chances are it'll fail. But my parents-in-law don't particularly mind. And we're seeing more of that. We are seeing a second generation of people taking over SMEs who are running it in quite a different way. I was reading recently about an SME that was involved in IT solutions in healthcare that acquired a company in Spain. They'd been business partners for 3 years, acquired this company, now expanding in Latin America. Another story about a company, very traditional garments company, acquiring an American or significant stake in an American garments company in order to do product design for the American market and expand more easily there. So things are happening.
But
it's
are
not
they,
some.
are they happening at the pace that you want them? I'll tell you a story from last night after the session with the Prime Minister, in which we touched on some of these issues of openness and the ability for people to flourish in an atmosphere which I was arguing is still more closed than perhaps than it needs to be for innovation. A group of students came by, wanted to take that photographs, and I asked them, "What did you think of that conversation?" And they all said, "No, you're right. There's too little space." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Does it worry you?" And three or five, they're probably in the audience now, so please contradict me if I'm wrong. But 3 or 5 of them said, "Yeah, we worry a lot about this, and we worry if we do not do well in this testing meritocracy, that we will have no place. That what do we do then?" So I said, "What would your answer be?" And they said, "Well, maybe leave Singapore, because the system still so privileges this testing pyramid that, and maybe we're not that great at testing, but maybe we have other skills."
So I think the fundamental feature of this system of meritocracy has been one where a much broader segment of the population has a real chance of succeeding. It's fair to kids who come from a poorer background. If you work hard, you can succeed. And the price of that is that it's competitive. It's a more competitive system than most, and that creates a fair bit of stress. How do we ensure that the same fairness and the drive that comes from a competitive meritocracy can be sustained whilst providing more space for people to reflect, to spend a good part of their time interacting with each other, and to just develop that originality of mind? That's a challenge, but we're starting from a very strong position.
No, but I would argue that the cost is not quite what you're describing. The cost is that you're measuring intelligence on a very narrow band.
I accept that.
Which may not actually prove to be the most important thing to success in life.
I accept that.
Right? And so you're getting all these guys to be good mandarins,
Right.
these men and women, but starting a company might be entirely different.
So I accept that, and as I mentioned earlier, as we evolve as an economy, as a society, these things have to evolve as well in education. We are broadening our meritocracy. If you look at what we're measuring in schools today, how you get from primary school to secondary school, how you get to secondary school and beyond, we're actually broadening the range of criteria. What talents you're measured in are not just your exam scores, and we still have further to go in that regard. In a sense, what we are doing is what you do in your private school and university system in the United States. If you look at the way the Ivy League select their students, highly discretionary. Right. If you look at the way the private schools advance students, but we're bringing it into a public school system. We're importing the lessons from a broad-based, holistic education that you get in the best private schools into a public school system, and we want to do it in a fair and meritocratic way. It's a challenge, but it's not a contradiction. It can be done. But it helps to start from a system that isn't broken, that people have confidence and trust in. That's a huge advantage.
All right, well, I'm going to open it up to questions. Before we do, I'm going to ask one question that I know nobody else will. Could Singapore have an Indian Prime Minister?
So I would say that on this one I needn't walk off the stage because I'm not interested. But I would say it seems to me inevitable that at some point a minority prime minister, Indian, Malay, Eurasian, or some mixture, is going to be a feature of the political landscape because we've got a meritocracy. It's an open system. It's just a matter of time.
But in a political system with 75% Chinese, it would be perfectly normal to say no. I mean, no. How could that happen?
Singapore's evolving. Singapore's evolving. There's a stronger sense of the common space that everyone is growing up in is much larger than it used to be pre-independence or even in our early decades. It's a pretty strong common space. It's an education system where everyone is educated with the first language English. You go through common experiences together, national service. So it's a matter of time.
So when William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general, was asked to run for the Republican nomination, he said no, and then they asked him again, And he said, if nominated, I will not accept. If elected, I will not serve. Are you making a Sherman-esque declaration on this subject?
Fortunately, I don't know enough about Sherman, but I think we actually have, fortunately, we have a great deal of trust and confidence in our current leadership and Prime Minister. Fortunately, he's very healthy. And we have, very importantly, in the wings, a group of younger people.
But you're 5 years younger than him.
Yeah, but let me put it this way. We all have our preferences, and I was always in sports center half rather than center forward. I enjoy playing halfback and making the long passes, but I'm not the striker unless I'm forced to be, and I don't think I'll be forced to it because I think we've got choices. It's not bad that we think so hard about succession. And we don't always get it the way we expect it to be, but we think very hard about succession in Singapore. And I think we've got a crop of people who are in the fray already and entering the fray who will provide future leadership.
Gillian. If you can identify yourselves, then.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Gillian Koh from IPS. Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. DPM, I'd like to invite you to offer the room that is thinking about 50 years from now, Singapore, what will it look like? Offer the room a narrative, a positive narrative of an aging Singapore. We know that about 9% of Singapore today is 65 years and over. Maybe 15 to 20% of Singapore in 2030 will be 65 years and over. We always speak about our aging Singapore as a sap on social spending, ceteris paribus. Worse, what if we have the grey vote that would reinforce that instinct to spend more on the seniors? They'd want it. And there would be a conservative type of politics that will enter into the landscape. And of course, even worse than that, with all the technological advances, we never think of the seniors as being able to take advantage of that, except to be consumers. So I accept also that today's seniors are probably not as well equipped to face the technological revolutions that we were speaking about earlier. But I think the young seniors of today and those who will be 65 will be quite different in 15 years from now. What would be the key tenets of this more positive narrative of an aging Singapore? And what are some of those key mechanisms in order to bring us to that future, that more positive vision of an aging society that we will be able to celebrate, I will be able to celebrate in 2065? Thank you, DPM.
Thank you. Well, I would say that my vision of Singapore 50 years from now is one where, first and foremost, people are encouraged and have a passion for learning throughout life. We've got to stretch out education, not front-load it so much. And everyone has to learn through life. And it's quite different from learning to get the best grades that you can in your examination. It's learning in a more fluid way because, as we know, the passion for learning develops at different stages of life. But that's a good society where everyone, regardless of what job or vocation they're in, or whether they're homemakers, is able to learn through life. And it will, I believe, if we do this right, make us amongst the global leaders in skills and innovation, with Singaporeans at the core of that. Second, we must be a place where you can age actively, not just gracefully, but actively. And we have the opportunity, because we have the resources. We're not starting with the problems that many other countries have of having large unfunded liabilities. We funded it. We funded it, and we'll continue to fund it. That's our fiscal strategy. And it helps that we've written into our constitution fiscal rules that ensure that we will always fund what we are doing in our spending.
What do you mean age actively? Explain that.
So it's first, our elderly themselves should continue learning and contributing to society. Some of them might contribute at work, in a different job, or in the same job but in a different way, and we've got to make our workplaces as elderly friendly as possible. We've got to maximize the role of the elderly in the community, because the elderly helping the elderly helping the young, I think there's tremendous potential for it. People gain satisfaction from being useful. They gain satisfaction from being useful, and we can make that possible in Singapore. So quite apart from the strengthening of our healthcare system, which is an essential, it's also about what's happening in society, giving the elderly a role and giving them the respect that comes from them being useful in society. Third, I would say quite importantly, we've got to go beyond what we have achieved in multiculturalism. It is a real achievement that we've got peace, we've got harmony, we've got everyone wanting to accommodate each other. But the Singapore of the future is not just about 4 circles and a common space in between, which is neutral, and we don't get one community asserting itself over the other. That's, of course, a precondition, and we must maintain that. It's also about overlapping circles. And you've got a deep core of the Singaporean identity that comes from respect for each other's cultures, respect for each other as individuals, and that's not deculturalized. It's having a love for diversity. And that, to my mind, is the Singapore of the future. Not just tolerant of each other, not just accommodating, and that's, of course, a rarity internationally, which we've got to preserve, but something much deeper than that. A love for diversity, a deep interest in each other. And I think we can achieve it.
So,
we also have Professor Anne Yee, who's standing
excellent.
there.
Okay.
I think, Anne, you were first, were you?
Yeah. Why don't you go
yes.
then?
Yeah.
So.
Anne Wee from NUS, I'll be 90 next year, so I'm fairly active. DPM, with great respect for all that you've said, could you please get the Cabinet to think of a way of getting second language without segregating ethnically the able children and the sub-school system? We get an able Chinese kid coming to the university who said, "Oh, I've never had a conversation with an Indian." And that is because able Indian and Malay children are transferred out if a school becomes a SAP school in the interests of the mother tongue. I'm mentioning Cabinet because I think it's too big an issue for the very able Mr. Heng. Can you please find a way of rethinking secondary education for the very able, so that our very able children stay together and get natural friendships? Thank you.
Can I? Can I just broaden that question, which is very fascinating? Lee Kuan Yew once said that the hardest policy he ever put in place was the bilingual education policy. That if he had to do it over again, he would have implemented it very differently. So throw that into the mix in this question.
So I think there are actually two quite distinct issues there. The first has to do with how much sorting you do, how early in life, based on ability, however we measure it. We have a system that's highly efficient, and the best proof of it, by the way, is not on what the most academically able students are able to achieve. The best proof of it is how students from the lowest socio-economic backgrounds, how they perform in Singapore compared to other countries. And one of the things about the PISA test is that there's this huge amount of data that shows up very interesting features. And Singapore's students from the lowest socioeconomic background, the lowest 10%, outperform those in other countries by a very significant margin. And that's partly because we have a curriculum that is suited to the needs of someone who starts off with less and helps them to catch up as much as possible. It's not perfect, but it's a practical way of providing the best education for everyone who needs, and people who need a different pace or style of learning. Having said that, there is another objective in education which is extremely important, which is to provide a commonality of experience, the daily interactions, and the mixing as you grow up with people of different abilities and different socioeconomic backgrounds. And that's also extremely important. And how we balance those two things, maximizing the potential of everyone by the time they leave school, and secondly, maximizing the potential for people to interact and develop a sense of fellowship that provides life skills that matter throughout your life, is a very important issue. Again, I would say we're starting from a good starting point because we have a system where everyone is able to achieve something real in education. But we have to evolve it as we go forward, and I am not too comfortable with the idea of simply gathering the most able students together and thinking that because it's a multiracial mix, that's a good idea. I think we need to have a little more free play in how people grow up and how much interaction they have with people of different abilities and different backgrounds. Then on the question of race and second language especially, I think again it's a balance. We're not starting from a blank piece of paper. We started with a system where we had distinct schooling and educational systems. And the SAP school system, which you mentioned briefly, is really a much smaller and watered-down version of our Chinese school system, which I'll have to say was a very rich heritage. It was a very rich heritage. So if you think of what I said earlier about 4 circles, and I spoke about not just having common space in between those 4 circles, but also deepening the overlap between the 4 circles. But I'd also say that if the whole society is just about overlap, and you don't have some way of preserving distinct cultures and the roots of our society, our branches are unlikely to flourish. So don't proceed very cautiously in removing things that already exist and have worked well, particularly when it comes to culture. Maximize common space, maximize the overlaps and that ability for kids to love diversity as they grow up. But don't get rid of everything that we started with in our history, because there were real strengths in them. So it's finding a balance.
Piyush Gupta, DBS Bank. DPM, seems to me a simple way that the last 50 years has been paraphrased by Lee Kuan Yew himself is our comparative strategy was predicated on building a first world infrastructure in a third world region. But that was both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. As we go forward, I'm extremely excited about the Smart Nation project because I think in that lies the germ of creating the world's first future city. And if we can create the first future city in the world that exists today, we could really distinguish ourselves exactly as we did 50 years ago. But to create that future city, we need both the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. Many of the projects we're trying to do today, hard infrastructure, are good. Sensors around the island, get the technology, focus on getting data wired up, Smart Nation. Some of the soft infrastructure challenges are very, very uncertain. And those involve behaviors and norms in a digital world, also involve legal thinking, laws, and how societies get constructed in a digital world. So for example, ubiquity of data changes the notion of privacy and how we think about individual rights, social rights, and privacy matters. Bitcoin technology or blockchain technology changes the notion of asset ownership. In fact, you could extend that and say the world of services on demand from computers changes the whole notion of what should be asset. Do you need to own a car or do you have Uber where you can get the car and service and so on? What are we doing as part of our thinking on Smart Nation to think about the softer issues, the legal constructs and behaviors that are needed to accompany a Smart Nation program?
Well, thank you, Piyush. It's a very important question. And I would just first restate very briefly the main point, which is that Smart Nation is ultimately not about technology, be it hardware or software. It's not about technology. It's about a society. And we've got to focus ultimately on what Smart Nation means for our society. It means, first of all, empowerment. Empowerment of the citizen, whether it's in transport or in healthcare or in getting a place to have a soccer match on the weekend. It's a way in which people feel empowered because you have a far more intelligent system in front of you that's not so difficult to manipulate. Second thing that is about accountability, because Smart Nation makes results much more obvious, much faster. Much faster. You can use a smartphone to just take a photo of a mess in a neighborhood, and everyone knows about it, and action has to be taken. And if it's not taken, well, then the authority in charge pays a price for it. So I think it's an evolution in our society taking advantage of technology, but it's ultimately about empowerment, including the elderly, empowering the elderly, and it's about accountability. I'm not answering your question fully, but I'm just giving you the essence of the reply.
I think that I know that some of you realize we have run late, and so unfortunately we are going to have to cut it off at this point. I want to say that 10 years ago when Kishore suggested that I meet Tharman, he said he was the smartest man in Singapore, and I think this session has demonstrated that lifelong learning is alive and well with Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.